Thank you very much for inviting me, and in fact it's partially not fair because I'm just a member of this Compendium community, and usually keynotes are coming from outside certain community, and I'm part of it. But probably because of the topic, crisis, because I'm coming from the country that is in permanent crisis, not only last 30 years, but even before, when we look today very idealistically with nostalgia to the former Yugoslavia and so on. But this was the country in permanent crisis, ethnic crisis, ideological crisis, and so on, only that was a little bit hidden and suppressed by leadership of Communist Party. That was, however, one system. So we citizens, we were aware of problems and we suffered, but somehow on the surface and from today's standpoint, everything was very nice and ideal and etc. It's also a little bit, and I have to say, because we are now here in European community. I am also part of one world community of experts, which is UNESCO Technical Facility. And that helped me to understand to what extent we are still far away of equity in the world. Why? When war in Ukraine started, our German colleagues sent a message, let's make as a UNESCO expert technical facility group, a huge statement and so on. I was the first to react and say, yes, we have to do it immediately, etc., etc. And then one by another, colleagues from Africa and Asia were sending different voice. Why you would like to do that? Why you have not reacted for Yemen war? What is different now? And so on. And they started sending us quotes from Western European press, mostly, because it's English-speaking press that everyone can gather. Our South African colleague, for example, combined all of that. And then we, for the first time, started to realize in how global, unequal world we are living when it comes to solidarity. And that's going to be kind of a let's say, red line of my speech, not only regarding inter-ethnic relations and so on, but all sorts of different dialogue. Now I have to learn to move it. Basically, this is just to say that what I'm going to tell is not coming just from my head. It's coming from multitude of voices of my colleagues, researchers engaged in all of those European, mostly, projects. Some of them are going beyond methodological nationalism, and I'm very happy specifically that we are now here in this environment of National Library with this exhibition, which I suggest you that you look at it, because it really shows why we have to go beyond methodological nationalism, which is German contribution to the world science, Ulrich Beck and Habermas and so on, because our compendium is a national-based resource. But this exhibition is showing the importance of intercultural and transcultural artistic relations, and it's using also, besides Romanian, French language, which we stopped to use in international relations. And I think I will just remind that when this expert group started, Council of Europe Evaluation of Cultural Policies, took precautions that at least 2 languages in Europe are used, French and English. It's a past tense now. No one is thinking carefully, so at least we are in the ambient that is speaking about it. So basically, my expose is going to be about ethics of cultural policy making ethics of cultural policy research, because we are researchers and our engagement should also be based on a certain, we state the need to reconsider standard approach of cultural sector and analysis and cultural policy evaluation. And I'm not going to speak about any of the three major crises of today because three other experts are going to devote, so it would be redundant to repeat, because we have war and humanitarian, migrant, COVID-19, climate crisis, and so on. I would like to speak about things that are rarely spoken about: democracy crisis, rise of illiberalism, even within EU. So it's not only our Balkan specificity, but we probably are more, more vocal in it, or more even using visual aids to demonstrate with monument policies what does it mean, really populist policy, by raising huge monuments, huge churches or other kind of temples just to contradict each other, or who is older nation, Antiquization in Macedonia and Bulgaria, medievalization in Serbia, for example, Illyrization in Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro. So who is the first nation on the Balkans? It's a very important cultural issue and cultural policy issue. The second forgotten issue about culture in exile. A week ago, I met my former students from Belarus, cultural operators, and they are all now in exile or in prison. And no one in the world is speaking about them. Belarus is forgotten, non-existent issue. Within Belarus, after this huge protest, that was, let's say, 6 months, everyone in the world was speaking about it. After protests had been crashed, oblivion. But there are not only Belarusians that are in exile. What about Kurds in exile? Now the question is raised because Finland and Sweden want in NATO, and then Turkey said no. Why? Because Kurds might have some rights in those Nordic countries. But generally, who is really supporting Kurdish culture in exile? How many? I had my next paper in the ICCPR conference is going to be Tears in the Classroom. And I'm going to speak about situations where my students cried. And one of them is Kurd from Iran, who during my lecture started to cry in Italy. The course was in Italy. Why? Because he never in his life ever heard anyone speaking about Kurdish culture. And I just mentioned it en passant. It was not the topic and so on. Plus, he said, none of my colleagues here know that I'm Kurd. Everyone addressed me as Iranian because I never ever publicly say that I'm Kurdish minority, because my parents, since I was a little one, they educated me not to. So how many cultures in exile around the world exist that no one is caring about, no one is supporting? International relations. Yes, we mentioned, and I also, I'm very eager to speak about colonization and decolonizing processes. And are decolonizing processes always really decolonizing, or are new form of patronizing put in a better politically correct term, and so on? So why embargo only against Russia? Why not against Saudi Arabia? Is this country also leading aggressive war in Yemen and not respecting human rights and so on? So we see there are very many issues that we might discuss and that are affecting cultural relations and support to cultural community. Believe me, in Yemen, we have a lot of colleagues. And we have a lot of cultural centers, especially in what was former socialist part of the Yemen. So it's a huge network of cultural institutions and so on. But maybe I used to have one question: have you ever met a cultural operator from Nagorno-Karabakh? And usually no one on any international conference met any cultural operator from Nagorno-Karabakh. And I just put it just to see that there are problems in the world that we have to reflect, but the same would be with Yemen. Have you ever met any cultural operator from Yemen? From Morocco or Syria? Maybe, yes, but not from these countries. So, but then the last issue. We have also many people in Europe that we never speak about in our conferences. I didn't have time really to look in every national profile to see, for example, what we are devoting in Serbia to Roma minority, or what in Sweden, what chapters of Compendium are devoted to Sami, or in Norway. In Finnish, probably it's already ongoing in the last 15 years and so on. But what Denmark is thinking, doing, collaborating, engaging, for example, of cultural operators from Greenland or from Faroe Islands and so on. So even the word North is recuperated. We are now speaking about global North as the richest and more powerful. But in fact, if you look who is living on this North shared Arctic, it's the poorest and deprived people. So a lot of topic to discuss, numerous dilemmas, and for us researchers, not really a lot of support how to deal with those issues. So just to enumerate, you might even forget this right side, I just wanted to show to what extent different theories, mostly coming from philosophy and theory of art, might be relevant for us cultural policy researcher to use about wars and its colonial nature of this war. For example, my colleagues in Mali, for them, French colonization is equal to Arabic colonization and Islamization of the country that is also deprived, French colonization deprived of the language, while Arabic colonization deprived them of their culture in its widest sense, of their religion. Only few tribes like the Dogons are kept right to sing and to dance, for example, which is deprived today to numerous castes. So apartheid, racism, and you would say, no, that does not exist in Europe. Of course it exists, and it exists throughout the world, and we are not reacting that much and that severe to apartheid, for example, in Israel regarding Palestinian population, as we are reacting to some other, let's say, bad policies. Migrations, global capitalism. I'm going to challenge that also. What does it mean for our field, for the impact on our research? Competitivity as such. Everyone is responsible to become successful and so on. Corruption, lack of social justice, finally COVID-19, but as I said, we are going to skip it. And I just wanted to use, because we are in Romania, the works of Dan Perzhovsky considering pandemics. But I would, however, like to show you another work of art of Vahida Ramujkic, Bosnian-Serbian artist, about, in fact, power of public policies. Are really we powerful cultural policies? Are we doing as we do, or as we should do, together with educational policies and create society, democracy? I mean, you are going to understand it's in French, justice, social justice, equality, etc., humanism. Because there is a bigger force than any public policy, which is the market force. and that is deteriorating this tissue that public policies are creating, specifically because that lately, and that's something for us to analyze, most of the public policies are taking not only as granted forces of market, they also want to stimulate all of us, even researchers, even academy, to go and to justify ourselves on the market. And that is very important thing. Another challenge of cultural policy started with the fact that it became academic discipline on one side, and on the other side that even this process, which was started in the 90s by Council of Europe, evaluation of national cultural policy, become more and more standardized, normativized, and so on. So it was a huge step. In my country, we could use these models and say, look, what does it mean to have a good cultural policy, to have a transparent cultural policy, to have, etc., etc. But now, this kind of normativization that put everything in a certain chapter is preventing us to see what is going on bottom up, to see these new issues which are coming from sector itself, not from policymaker. Unfortunately, as policymakers dispose with the money, they launch competition, even EU for the research. So if you want as a researcher money, you adapt your thinking to the proposal, using the keywords that are appearing in the proposal and so on. It's not a censorship, but it's auto-censorship that we are doing due to financial reasons. So I just use this, but I already spoke about language because it's also important. This was a sarcastic artwork from the beginning of the 90s of Croatian artist Mladen Stilinovic, unfortunately late one. And, but it's the same with a researcher. Researcher who is not speaking English, he doesn't exist. He cannot justify his work in the world. 80% of the world knowledge is published in English language, and that's it. I couldn't keep my place at university if I hadn't published in English journals, because that's the journals that counts, and so on. So we have to think about it, because this dependence on one language is preventing us of many concepts that were developed. So I'm going to use just one French concept that disappeared from our debate, just because it's not easily translatable in English. Animation socioculturelle. It doesn't exist anymore as a real concept. Probably because it's also not linked to the market, it's linked to something else. But one fact is also that it's forgotten, as many other concepts developed with minor languages. And I think that can be interesting, that Compendium society develops. So what is the role of university in it? I know that we don't have time, so I'm just not going to speak about it, but you might see what university was. Critical university. Now we are officially asked to train people for skills, not for critical thinking. It's going somehow to happen and to come. But if you really want, and you see in Guardian yesterday, was a huge article about abolishing English literature course on one of British university. Humanities is abolished throughout Europe without much discussion. Yes, you might say universities are autonomous, but in fact, academic capitalism is prevailing. So only departments that are marketable are safe. Luckily, cultural policy is joined with cultural management, which happen to be extremely profitable department in present days. So we are, let's say, still safe, as a difference from our colleague Goldsmith, for example, nearly killed its historical department. So history, classical languages, other forms of humanities, comparative literature, no use, no concrete skill. When I remember when our Minister of Culture asked me, when you say cultural study, for what kind of jobs you are training your students? I said for all sorts of jobs. First of all, the jobs that need thinking. So Minister was pretty curious about it. So anyway, we have to jump over certain, but I would say that even in cultural field, you see, Jeff Koons in Versailles, what kind of cultural policy it is? Could that be possible, for example, in 70s when the developmental and democratic paradigm was? But now, even Michel Meunier, who used to be some of these leaders of European Union, said on ELIA conference that were aimed to professors of art schools and art students, you all have to look at Damien Hirst as the role model. So by the way, that was, I think, 5 years ago, 2017, I get really mad because Damien Hirst made his career really based on market trends and tendencies. Biggest collector, Ukrainian tycoon. Today would be nicer if it was a Russian tycoon, then you can say this is really evil guy because he was bought by Russian tycoon and he let his works to be overpaid by Russian tycoon, but in his case, unfortunately, it was Ukrainian one. So consumerism, spectacularization, because what is else than Guy Debord warned us in '67 about Société de Spectacle, but what we are living today is exactly that. On one side, spectacularization, on other, populism and nationalism in Hungary, in Poland, throughout the Balkans, but I would say in more and more Western countries, only, however, they still have some better, let's say, results. So yes, we can speak about growing nationalism and thinking about it. For example, Venice Biennial. All my students adore going, and I have to say, always using opportunity, going to holiday in Istria to jump even to the architectural biennial or to visual arts biennial. But the concept of nation-state biennial were hardly approved Roma Pavilion in 2007 and 2011, that was it. Because what if Kurds would appear next time and ask for their pavilion? What the Turks are going to say? That was the real response to me, because I was one of the, let's say, founders and organizers of Roma Pavilion in Venice in 2007, first time, and that was real question from the organizers of Biennial. Anyway, we have to really question those all these key issues in our work. What does it mean? Supporting this kind of concept, which was developed end of the 19th century, and we all know why the first festivals of contemporary kind was in Bayreuth and why the first visual art was in Italy, because both countries wanted to reinforce their nation statehood, which was relatively recently created at the end of 19th century. But unfortunately, somehow, we are not questioning it today. So I would like to come back. Somehow I missed the talk, although I thought about censorship, because in this afternoon we are going to speak more about artistic freedom and freedom of the speech. And to say that the results of contemporary populist politics are different forms of censorship that many inclined not to understand. For example, recently, me and my colleagues sent to peer reviewing text about censorship in performing arts, and peer reviewers, British ones, they made question, what does it mean financial? You can't call financial censorship censorship. The fact that someone has not received money from the state, it's not a censorship. But if it is, for example, 15 years of the same governance, that certain number of theater troupes never get a penny on the public competition while they have books about them in United States, for example, Serbian case of Dah Theater, that's a financial censorship. That's a form of asphyxiation and so on. About direct political censorship, it's still present. Even in Poland, if you look what they ask now of their museum, even of Solidarność Museum, Gdańsk Museum of 20th Century, museum in Wrocław, which was built for the celebration of Wrocław Cultural Capital, Pan Tadeusz Museum, which I visited because when I hear book-related museum, I always go. It was not a literature museum. It was a museum of Polish patriotism. Still okay, but to open European Cultural Capital about a book that says in the first phrase, "O Lithuania, my motherland," and so on, without any consideration of those words, somehow doesn't sound European. This transcultural dimension of Europe is disappearing. My students in Poland, for example, they are reading poetry of Czesław Miłosz, but they are not reading the book, The Other Europe. In Polish, it's not part of, because this book is about all these intercultural, transcultural links of Central Europe and Baltic states and so on. So it's not à la mode those days. I assume I would have to finish. So the issue is, are we brave enough today to create a European narrative in this time of nationalism and populism? Can we find today relevant contemporary books as it was at the end of 80s, beginning of 90s, Jean-Marie Domenach or Edgar Morin, all these books about European identities that are old-fashioned now? But where are the new ones? The new ones with the new concepts and so on. How we can go through, how we ended up from the margins, that was the key book of Council of Europe in 1995, to creative industries of today. Why we are speaking about migrants and not about exiliants? Are these people really migrating? I could be migrant if I go somewhere and decide to live. But most of what we call migrants are not migrants. They're exiliants because they have to. All my Belarus students today are in exile. Most of, not all, but most of Russian students that live abroad are also in exile. Only few of them are on their own. And by the way, you see here how Austrian nationalist in Innsbruck is beating the artist for performing in favor of migrants. So an act of hospitality can be only poetic, said Derrida, and I would like that we all go back to his books and to his this is also one of the drawing of Dan Perzhowski that is nicely describing what I want to say. The persons are thrown away from the country of origin, but the same happens with the country of destination. There was many initiatives, many artistic reactions in Europe. I remind here Christoph Schlingensief, because it was really one of the first that was using the format of Big Brother, of the tabloid press and so on, to speak about relationship toward foreigners and so on. Unfortunately, obviously, it didn't help much for the change. This issue we are going to skip as we do not have a time. our collaborative projects across the borders that are not always ethically, how it's say, concerned. It was about, I will suggest you to look at this so-called official apology of the National Theatre of Norway from shameful collaboration with Habima, which is Israeli National Theatre, not because it's Israeli, it's because they perform on the occupied territories. And that is crossing a red line. So it's not embargo to Israeli artists, Israeli organizations. It's a reconsidering role of public institution. So don't say the F word, future, and so on. Is heritage always possible? What about heritage of violence, dissonant heritage? We are now really present, and now it's a moment to say one warning for all of you coming from EU. Because what Russia is doing to Ukraine those days, claiming that Ukraine does not exist, one of EU countries is doing to one potential candidate, Bulgaria to Northern Macedonia, claiming that Macedonian language do not exist, their culture do not exist, etc., etc. And Europe till now is accepting Bulgarian veto. And that's very interesting for me, how and why. And France wants to negotiate, but somehow still say that Macedonians have to limit their identity issues and to obey what Bulgaria is asking them to renounce their own language, because Bulgarians said it's socialist invention. Macedonia was approved during socialism as a separate Republic of Yugoslavia. That's true, because Kingdom of Yugoslavia wanted to treat Macedonian as southern Serbians. So it was also colonial attitude. All brothers of my grandmother were killed in the First World War, thinking they are fighting for Serbs that live in Macedonia, but thinking that they are Serbs. So my grandmother went in 1920, and she immediately realized that those people are not Serbs, they are different. But government, kingdom, didn't approve it. Socialist government approved. But now, one EU country said it's socialist invention. It's not, sorry. And interesting enough, in Europe, this discussion is led on political level. Where are we, experts, historians, linguists, and so on? We are nowhere. Our voice is nowhere to be heard, and so on. So there is a lot of more, but we are going, by the way, just I wanted to say, do we always have to respect national tradition as something super and good? In many countries, women are outside, like in India. Caste, for even men and women, not participating, but here we have a huge effort to integrate. So tradition is not always positive. Tradition can be asphyxiating. Here you see Kathakali, Brahmin theater form, everywhere in the world. We studied that in history of theater. Kataikutu, even India is not, how to say, acclaiming it. Why? Because it's a Dalit form. Untouchables, etc., etc. So what should be, and that's the end, our art management responses, commons, public good, solidarity, it was mentioned, empathy, hospitality, sharing practices, echoing multitude voices, decoloniality, and that would be who is responsible. We are all responsible. And again, to finish with Dan Pershowski word, exist means resist. Thank you very much.